I parked my car at the curb, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over our quiet suburban street in Texas. The air was warm with the scent of freshly cut grass and faintly of jasmine from the hedges lining the driveway. I took a deep breath before stepping out, smoothing the dress I had chosen for my sister's birthday gathering. Not that it mattered much, I knew, as always, that I would blend into the background. I had learned over the years to move quietly, to observe rather than be observed, and to offer help without expectation of recognition. My gift, carefully wrapped in pale blue paper, felt heavier in my hands than its size warranted, as though it carried all the unsaid hopes of being noticed, of being valued. Walking up the path, I noticed the small details first. The napkins folded into delicate triangles, the floral arrangement of roses and lilies that my mother had insisted on arranging herself, and the soft music filtering from inside the house. Guests were arriving, laughter spilling out the open door, mingling with the scent of homemade food. My sister, always radiant in her confidence, welcomed everyone with that effortless charm that made me shrink just a little, a familiar ache in my chest. I reminded myself to breathe, to smile, to be present, even if invisibility had been my companion for far too long. I could almost feel the ghosts of past birthdays hovering at the edges of the room, the whispered compliments that never came, the unacknowledged efforts, the quiet sacrifices I had made for the family I loved, but that rarely noticed me. Inside, conversations buzzed lightly, polite and precise. I drifted from guest to guest, sharing small talk, nodding at achievements I had heard about from my older siblings, noticing the subtle ways they were lauded while I lingered at the periphery. A small, dismissive remark from my sister about the color of my scarf prickled against the surface of my calm demeanor, stirring a flicker of irritation. The years of quietly being the helper gnawed at me in that instant, and I caught myself replaying old memories, instances where my efforts had been overlooked, where my ideas had been dismissed, where my presence had been tolerated but rarely celebrated. My pulse quickened slightly, though I kept my tone measured and polite. I excused myself, stepping onto the porch for some air, and pulled out my phone. The sunlight was softer here, filtering through the branches overhead, but the warmth did little to ease the tension tightening in my chest. The screen lit up with an unexpected call from my neighbor. I answered, the casual tone of his greeting sounding innocuous enough until he asked the question, "Who's in your house?" The words hung in the air, oddly phrased, almost off-kilter. A chill ran down my spine. I froze, heart picking up pace. Was it concern, curiosity, or something more unsettling? My mind raced, searching for context in the mundane, attempting to ground myself in logic while my instincts raised alarms. I felt a surge of mild paranoia. Questions flooded in. Why now? Who else would know to call? Could someone have entered the house without my knowledge? The neighbor's casual demeanor only amplified the unease, and I found myself scrutinizing every word for hidden meaning, every pause for a hint of intent. This innocuous question, seemingly ordinary, now felt loaded, a small crack in the veneer of normalcy. My mind toggled between reason and suspicion, weighing the possibilities without revealing my apprehension. Leaning against the railing, I let my thoughts drift back to the countless times I had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. I connected the patterns from my past, being invisible at gatherings, being ignored in discussions, being taken for granted, with this unsettling moment. The familiar ache of invisibility transformed into a subtle resolve. If there was a threat, I would meet it not with panic, but with careful, deliberate action. I noticed a framed family photo on the wall inside, the image of my younger self, smiling and eager, yet always on the sidelines. That photograph now seemed to anchor me, a reminder that I had endured before and could navigate this moment as well. I set the phone down briefly, collecting my thoughts. Calmly, I mapped out possible responses, mentally rehearsing what I could say or do to uncover the intent behind the question without showing vulnerability. My anxiety was still present, but a quiet sense of agency began to surface. I reminded myself that observation was power, that patience could be as strong a weapon as confrontation. Every step, every word, every glance would now be measured, deliberate, a dance of intellect and caution in the midst of uncertainty. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and pink, I made a decision. I would not react impulsively. I would watch, listen, and uncover the meaning behind that single question. Little did I know that single question from my neighbor would unravel more than just a misunderstanding. What I was about to discover would change everything. I slipped away from the main room, letting the laughter and chatter wash over me as I moved toward the kitchen. The faint clinking of glasses and the smell of freshly baked cake guided me to the quieter corner near the sliding doors that led to the backyard. I leaned against the counter, unnoticed, and let my eyes wander over the gathering, watching the subtle exchanges, the half-smiles, the shared glances, the hushed murmurs that spoke of unspoken alliances and rivalries. My attention shifted to small details, a half-full glass left on the edge of the counter, a party favor toppled sideways on the table, a slice of cake missing from the meticulously decorated dessert. These minor cues pulled at my awareness, hinting at undercurrents I had never fully acknowledged before. A cousin lingered nearby, adjusting the napkins on the table, and I caught snippets of conversation meant to be private. Words about responsibility, past decisions, and family hierarchies floated my way. I heard a familiar refrain, one I had felt all my life. She's always the helper, never in the spotlight. The sting was immediate, but instead of anger, I felt a growing recognition. This pattern had followed me, quietly dictating my place, shaping expectations, and keeping me on the edges of notice. The observation of these small, private interactions sharpened my awareness. The nuances, the selective praise, the tiny dismissals, all painted a picture I had only glimpsed before. I remembered the neighbor's call, that strangely phrased question, "Who's in your house?" It now felt connected to these domestic undercurrents. Someone else had noticed what I had long sensed, the subtle sidelining, the quiet invisibility that I had endured. The realization made my chest tighten, a mixture of validation and unease. There was a strange comfort in knowing I wasn't imagining it, yet the thought that others could monitor or comment on our family's private life unsettled me. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to anticipate motives and consequences without revealing a tremor of concern. Returning briefly to the kitchen, I navigated polite exchanges with my sister and a few other relatives. Each compliment carried a faint edge, each question seemed designed to elicit compliance. A card lay on the countertop, my handwriting visible yet unacknowledged, a small token that had already begun to feel like a symbol of my efforts and their invisibility. The gift tags, the careful wrapping, even the decorations seemed to mock the quiet diligence that often went unnoticed. I tucked the card away, straightened a napkin, and allowed a controlled sigh to escape. Small gestures of resistance hidden behind a composed exterior. I began to plan, mentally mapping out a strategy for the evening. I would observe, note, and remember each slight, each hidden glance, each whispered comment. Patience would be my ally. If needed, I could later leverage these details, but for now, discretion and calm were paramount. I felt a quiet empowerment begin to grow, a sense of intelligence in navigating tension, an awareness that the game had many layers and I could play it without losing myself to frustration or impulse. The backyard offered a brief respite, a place where the late evening breeze brushed against my face and carried the scent of blooming flowers. I paused, letting the subtle quietude sharpen my senses. Shadows lengthened across the lawn, and I could hear the distant murmur of guests inside, unaware of my silent watch. My thoughts kept returning to the neighbor's call, weaving it into the fabric of this evening's observations. Every detail now seemed part of a larger picture, and I was determined to piece it together with care, caution, and a clear mind. As I tucked away the card and straightened the napkins, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's birthday was only the beginning of a story far more complicated than anyone realized. The living room felt smaller somehow, though I knew the square footage hadn't changed. The laughter, clinking glasses, and snippets of conversation created a rhythm I tried to ignore, yet I couldn't help noticing the patterns, the way certain family members leaned toward each other, sharing a private joke or an approving glance, while I remained on the edges of their attention. My eyes swept over the seating arrangements, noting who had the prime spots closest to the birthday cake. who received the early compliments, who was asked for advice on the gift selection. Every glance, every half-smile seemed calculated, yet subtle enough to feel accidental to anyone else. My frustration grew quietly, a simmering mix of irritation and determination, as I realized these were not random moments, they were habitual, recurring, invisible hierarchies I had long sensed but never confronted. A sudden comment from my older brother caught me off guard. He praised a decoration I had painstakingly arranged, yet phrased it as though he had contributed to the idea first. The credit, small as it was, belonged to me. My mouth tightened into a thin line, an internal shrug concealing the prick of irritation. The initial shock morphed into an internalized anger that warmed my chest, reminding me of every overlooked birthday, every invisible effort from my past. I let the moment pass outwardly, keeping my nod polite, yet internally I catalogued the slight, its details etched in my awareness for later consideration. Memories of earlier birthdays, childhood dinners, and family gatherings began to drift into my mind like ghosts. I remembered the times I had been the quiet helper, never celebrated, often overlooked even when my contributions were essential. The connections between past and present were impossible to ignore. The same dynamics repeated, the same subtle power plays enacted, generation after generation. I felt a bittersweet sadness, tinged with recognition and a quietly burning resolve. Patterns that once left me feeling powerless now stirred a sense of cautious insight. I could see the contours of the unspoken rules, the hidden expectations, and the silent resentments that fueled them. With that awareness, I began to consider my next moves, mentally outlining strategies to protect myself without revealing weakness. I could watch, record, and remember. A carefully placed note, the alignment of a photo, even the way I arranged napkins on the table, all became potential tools to assert my presence subtly, to mark the moments that mattered without exposing vulnerability. A small photograph caught my eye, sitting half obscured on the mantel, a reminder of my place in the family's history. It was a quiet symbol, yet one that anchored me in a growing sense of control and foresight. The subtle confrontations began to accumulate. My sister asked for my opinion on a trivial matter with a sweetness that felt rehearsed, while her glance suggested she expected compliance rather than insight. A cousin offered a polite smile as they interrupted my story mid-sentence, a gesture innocent to them, sharp to me. Micro-expressions and fleeting gestures conveyed more than the words could, revealing awareness, approval, or silent disapproval. My frustration remained controlled, restrained, a quiet storm beneath composed surfaces. Every interaction was another piece of the puzzle, each requiring careful observation and measured response. As the evening deepened, I realized the minor slights and oversights were not isolated incidents. They formed a consistent pattern, an intricate web of behaviors designed to position me quietly on the margins. My mind sharpened, tracing the contours of these interactions, plotting how to navigate the remainder of the night with precision and patience. I understood now that this birthday was more than a celebration. It was an illustration of family dynamics in action, a map of influence and neglect I had to read with care. Every smile, every glance tonight seemed rehearsed, and I knew the game was just beginning. By the time the dinner plates were cleared, the room seemed heavier, charged with subtle energy that I couldn't ignore. I noticed the slight shifts in posture, the way some family members leaned in toward one another, exchanging hushed remarks that skirted the edges of civility. A misplaced gift on the side table caught my eye, a small, thoughtful token I had brought, now half hidden beneath napkins that had been shuffled carelessly. My frustration simmered, tempered by the need to stay composed. I knew better than to let irritation slip into visible anger, yet every minor exclusion and whispered exchange sharpened my awareness, like a sensor tuned to the undercurrents of power in the room. A quiet remark from my sister's husband broke my mental reverie. He praised the salad I had prepared, yet his tone implied I had merely assisted rather than created it. I clenched my jaw for a fraction of a second, forcing a polite nod while cataloging the slight mentally. Every effort I made to contribute, every small gesture of care, seemed to dissolve into the background of their recognition. The moment stung, yet beneath it lay a seed of calculated resolve. I would not let this pattern go unobserved. I moved toward the kitchen under the guise of checking on the drinks, but my attention never wavered. There, amidst the clatter of utensils and the hum of conversation from the dining area, I caught snippets of dialogue that hinted at minor manipulations, credit claimed for accomplishments that weren't theirs, suggestions planted to diminish my presence. My indignation grew, a quiet, simmering fire. I thought of past events, past injustices, the times I had been passed over, unheard, overlooked. Now, the subtle indignities of tonight crystallized into clarity. There was a method to this casual erasure. Pulling out my notebook discreetly, I jotted down small observations, the way a cousin's eyes lingered a moment too long on my actions, the misalignment of seating that seemed intentional, the repeated ways my ideas were paraphrased as someone else's. Each entry reinforced my sense of control, of strategy. I realized that patience, careful documentation, and selective engagement would be my weapons. Every micro-expression, every polite but loaded comment became a piece of the puzzle I was determined to solve. A minor confrontation arose naturally when my sister asked for my opinion on a seemingly trivial arrangement of the dessert table. I offered my insight calmly, knowing full well that it might be dismissed or credited to someone else. Her smile was polite, but her eyes held a subtle calculation. These unspoken warnings, layered with civility, taught me more than any overt argument could. I noted them mentally, storing each detail for future leverage while maintaining outward composure. The tension was palpable, yet invisible, a quiet game of recognition and control. As I stepped back and surveyed the room from the kitchen doorway, it became evident that tonight was more than a simple celebration. The minor slights, the subtle manipulations, and the unspoken expectations formed a pattern that demanded careful navigation. My mind worked swiftly, organizing observations, planning responses, and anticipating potential moves in the intricate dance of family dynamics. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The game had shifted, and now I had to decide my next move. As the evening deepened and the last of the casual chatter faded into murmurs of polite goodbyes, I found myself lingering in the living room, surveying the subtle hierarchy that unfolded around me. Every glance, every fleeting smile, every half-hearted acknowledgement of my efforts was a data point I cataloged carefully. The frustration that had simmered in earlier hours had now sharpened into something more deliberate, a quiet resolve. I reviewed the patterns of neglect, the repeated misattributions of credit, and the minor manipulations that had quietly punctuated the evening. Each slight, each overlooked effort became fuel for a plan I was beginning to construct in my mind. An indirect challenge arrived in the form of a seemingly casual remark from my younger cousin, who praised the centerpiece I had arranged for the table, but added with a thin smile, "Of course, it wouldn't have been perfect without a bit of your touch." The words were small, almost polite, yet the insinuation stung. My lips pressed together, and I allowed only the briefest flicker of surprise to cross my face before reclaiming composure. Internally, I noted the discrepancy, storing it alongside the others as material for careful consideration. Patience was my ally. Impulsive reaction would only reveal my hand too soon. From the corner of the room, a subtle gesture caught my attention. A nod from an older cousin who had always been observant. A silent acknowledgement that I was not invisible to everyone. She leaned close to her husband, murmured something under her breath, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the reassuring warmth of potential support. Hope mixed cautiously with vigilance. I calculated carefully how this piece of information could be leveraged in the days ahead, aware that too much transparency might alert the more calculating relatives. Each conversation, each exchange of glances, became part of a growing map of relationships and possible alliances. I began testing boundaries, quietly shifting a chair closer to the table where discussions of credit for the evening's arrangements arose. A gentle clarification here, a discreet correction of misattributed praise there. I moved like a strategist, measuring reactions in micro-expressions, in subtle changes of tone. The tension within me was a mix of anxiety and exhilaration. Small victories stoked a sense of empowerment I had not felt in years. The family, largely unaware, continued their polite masquerade, but I felt the first real stirrings of control returning to my hands. In the backyard, where the air carried the faint scent of summer flowers and the distant echo of children's laughter from earlier, I positioned myself to observe without being observed. I jotted small notes in my mind, cataloging the inconsistencies and minor slights. My silent assertion took shape, not as confrontation, but as a mental blueprint for strategy. If the evening's subtle manipulations had been recorded, I would have a ledger of justice to refer to when needed. The power of observation, patience, and careful planning became my quiet companion, bolstering my confidence in ways that open argument never could. As I tucked away the notebook and adjusted a misplaced napkin on the table, a sense of clarity settled over me. The evening had revealed both vulnerabilities and opportunities, a delicate balance I intended to navigate with precision. Everything I'd observed so far had been a prelude. Tonight, the real test was about to begin. By the time the dining area quieted, the air had thickened with unspoken tensions that I could almost taste. I surveyed the room like a general assessing the battlefield, noting who held influence, who stayed on the sidelines, and who could be trusted to recognize subtle truths without tipping off the rest. Every smile, every polite nod, every side glance was cataloged in my mind. My past caution guided each observation, reminding me not to overstep, yet I could feel a rising readiness to act when the moment demanded it. The previous hour's frustrations had crystallized into strategy. I wasn't here to fight recklessly, I was here to maneuver with intelligence. A minor slight cut across the polite surface, a casual remark from my sister about how smoothly the evening had gone, implying, without naming me, that her efforts alone had made the night successful. The sting was immediate, the humiliation subtle but precise. I swallowed it, maintaining a calm exterior while mentally filing it for later. Patience was my weapon. As I noted the subtle alliances forming, the knowing glance exchanged between my cousin and aunt, the slight hesitation in a sibling's response, I recognized the lines of power that would dictate the moves I made next. I could feel the quiet hum of anticipation in the room, like a circuit ready to spark. Tension escalated when a younger relative openly questioned a contribution I had made to the dinner setup, attributing my work to someone else with a smile that barely hid their mischief. I felt the surge of indignation rise, sharp and immediate, but I breathed through it, restraining the urge to retaliate impulsively. Instead, I weighed the options, considering consequences and the potential gains from a measured response. Every micro-expression, every nuance of tone, became data I could use strategically. The air seemed charged, a delicate balance of civility and competition that demanded subtle maneuvering. I shifted focus to quiet countermeasures. I clarified contributions indirectly, placing small notes by items I had arranged, reorienting chairs with a careful hand, all while engaging in light conversation that drew attention away from my intentions. The small victories began to accumulate. A nod of acknowledgement here, a polite thank you there. Each one bolstered my confidence and reminded me that influence didn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it was the quiet assertion of presence, the invisible threads you wove while others thought they controlled the narrative. I documented everything mentally, noting reactions, storing them for moments when a larger assertion might be necessary. As I reflected on these small victories, I felt a subtle transformation within. The internal tension that had once weighed me down had begun to shift into a controlled, strategic empowerment. I understood that tonight's skirmishes were only the opening moves in a longer game. My identity, my patience, my intelligence, they were my allies now, reinforcing a sense of authority I had never allowed myself to claim before. The emerging assertive identity carried with it the promise of action that was deliberate, precise, and undeniably effective. And then I noticed it. A subtle lapse in attention from one of the key players, a vulnerability in the room's carefully maintained hierarchy. Opportunity, quiet and inviting, presented itself without need for provocation. I leaned back, observing without exposing the recognition I felt, preparing to exploit the opening when the timing was right. Tonight was only the first move. The real test of my patience and cunning was about to begin. The evening air carried a tension that felt almost tangible as I settled back into the living room, eyes scanning the room with renewed purpose. Subtle shifts in family dynamics hadn't escaped me. I could sense which relatives were quietly aligned and which ones were silently assessing me, weighing every gesture and word. There was a delicate balance of power here, a fragile equilibrium that I now understood I could influence without overplaying my hand. My awareness sharpened, each observation feeding into a mental map of leverage points, allies, and potential pitfalls. For the first time in a long while, I felt the cautious optimism that came with knowing my position and, more importantly, my right to assert it. A minor confrontation erupted, almost imperceptible, when a sibling questioned my contribution to the evening's dinner setup. Their tone was polite, but the underlying implication was clear. They assumed, or wanted others to assume, that I had done less than my share. I responded with a quiet correction, asserting my role without letting frustration show. The exchange was brief but electrifying, a surge of nervous energy mixed with exhilaration. I watched their reaction, noting the subtle hesitation that betrayed acknowledgement. Small victories like this built confidence, each one proving that careful, intelligent assertion could shift perceptions without causing unnecessary conflict. As I retreated briefly to a corner, my thoughts returned to past slights, a mental inventory of all the times I had been overlooked, dismissed, or miscredited. There, tucked between the memory of forgotten achievements and unacknowledged efforts, lay the evidence I could leverage. Twist S14 revealed itself in the form of a handwritten note from years ago, a subtle reminder of my overlooked contributions. Anger surged quietly, sharpened by clarity, fueling a sense of determination that was both calculated and controlled. The slow pacing of reflection allowed me to organize these insights, identifying patterns in behavior and potential weaknesses in those who underestimated me. Returning to the group, I began to weave influence subtly. I corrected small misattributions under the guise of casual conversation, gently reinforcing my competence while avoiding overt confrontation. My presence, once easy to overlook, now carried weight. Family members began to acknowledge my input, sometimes with a fleeting nod, sometimes with a slightly prolonged glance that hinted at recognition. Each subtle victory reinforced my growing empowerment and sense of control over the narrative. I could feel the shift. The room was no longer entirely governed by the assumptions and hierarchies I had endured for years. By the time the garden doors opened to let in the evening breeze, I had positioned myself strategically, having tested the waters, gauged reactions, and quietly asserted influence. Every decision, every observation had brought me closer to the moment when a decisive action could tip the balance entirely. I understood that the turning point wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. It was the accumulation of small, intelligent moves that demonstrated competence, demanded respect, and revealed the cracks in the facade others maintained. I paused near the edge of the patio, looking back toward the living room where conversations continued under a veneer of civility. The pieces were in place, each ally and adversary accounted for, each reaction noted and catalogued. I felt the controlled thrill of anticipation, knowing that the final hand was soon to be played. My confidence mingled with patience, ready to act with precision when the opportunity arrived. I had the pieces in place. All that was left was to play the final hand, and nothing would be the same after tonight. The evening had settled into a tense quiet, punctuated only by the occasional clink of cutlery or soft murmur of conversation in the living room. I stood near the edge of the gathering, taking in the room with careful attention, cataloging faces, gestures, and subtle shifts in posture. Tonight wasn't just another dinner, it was the culmination of months of observation, of careful note-taking, and of mental rehearsals. Every slight, every misattribution, every overlooked effort had been logged in my mind, ready to be addressed. Allies were identified, those who could be counted on for quiet support, and adversaries marked, their weaknesses now mapped with clarity. I breathed slowly, centering myself, letting determination sharpen into a focused edge. There would be no hasty actions tonight, only precision. It began with a carefully chosen question directed at my sister, one that seemed casual but carried weight. "So who actually organized the garden decorations?" I asked, keeping my tone light, but the implication was deliberate. A pause, a subtle hesitation crossed her face, and I noted every micro-expression. The room held its breath in that instant, family members sensing the undercurrent of challenge. I let the moment stretch, observing reactions, letting the small pressure build. This was Twist S15, the first real test, a measured public challenge that exposed assumptions and invited accountability without a single raised voice. Satisfaction coursed quietly through me as the first cracks appeared, but the tension escalated almost immediately. My sister attempted a clever deflection, spinning a narrative that minimized my efforts and subtly undermined my credibility. Twist S16 unfurled like a storm. Frustration rose in me, but I restrained it, letting calculation guide my response. I noted her patterns, the subtle ways she shifted blame and gauged her allies' reactions. This wasn't just about emotion, it was about leverage, about turning strategy into visible influence. Every word she spoke was met with measured attention, each retort a piece of intelligence to be used later. The back and forth heightened, rapid in exchange, but deliberate in observation, until the room's undercurrent hummed with anticipation. Then, carefully, I made my decisive move. Twist S17. Drawing on all my prior observations and the evidence tucked into memory, I recounted a series of past contributions that had been overlooked. I laid out events, gently correcting misconceptions, exposing inconsistencies in a narrative others had accepted unquestioningly. The effect was immediate. Faces shifted, eyebrows rose, and a few nodded subtly, acknowledging the truth I presented. Triumph coursed through me, tempered by awareness that victory here wasn't about humiliation, but clarity. I had restored balance, not dominance, established my merit without rancor, and reminded everyone of the intelligence and moral grounding guiding my actions. As the final moments of the confrontation settled, the room was thick with a new awareness. Family members now had a clearer understanding of the contributions I had made, of the patience and strategy I wielded. Allies offered quiet nods, and the subtle power balance had shifted in my favor. But beneath the relief was caution, a recognition that relationships and perceptions are fragile, that reconciliation or further tension might follow. I stepped back, taking in the garden where moonlight dappled the flowers, and allowed a moment of quiet satisfaction to wash over me. The pieces were finally on the table, but would everyone see the truth? And could I forgive what had been done? The morning sun spilled softly across the living room, casting long shadows over the furniture that had witnessed the night's confrontations. I lingered by the window, cup of coffee warming my hands, replaying the events of the previous evening. The tension that had gripped the room, the subtle hesitations, the acknowledgement of truths long overlooked, all of it still lingered in my mind, but now tempered by a quiet sense of accomplishment. Relief mixed with vigilance. I knew that even in victory, awareness had to remain. Yet, for the first time in years, I felt the weight of being truly seen, understood, and respected. Allies exchanged glances with me, small nods and subtle smiles conveying their recognition and silent validation. In that moment, I realized how much personal growth had been accrued, a slow transformation turning frustration into clarity and observation into empowered action. By late morning, the family had gathered more casually, and the air felt lighter, yet charged with cautious optimism. Twist S18 unfolded as my sister approached, her posture open but tinged with the awkwardness of accountability. "I realize I've overlooked your contributions," she admitted, voice careful but sincere. The words, simple as they were, carried the weight of years of tension, a subtle confession that finalized the family dispute. I responded with calm acknowledgement, reinforcing my boundaries while accepting the gesture without judgment. Other family members too adjusted, conversations flowing with new honesty and mutual recognition. The minor subplots, long-standing misunderstandings, small grudges, the invisible hierarchies, began to resolve themselves, leaving clarity in their wake. The family dynamics had shifted, not with vengeance, but through quiet confrontation and principled persistence. Walking through the garden in the late morning light, I reflected on my own journey. Every slight, every ignored effort, every subtle manipulation from the past had been catalogued and transformed into insight. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant understanding, learning, and choosing strength over silence. The cool breeze carried a sense of liberation, and with it, the realization that my own empowerment had grown not from confrontation alone, but from the disciplined patience and careful strategy I had cultivated. I felt gratitude for the lessons, for the patience honed, and for the clarity of purpose that had allowed me to navigate treacherous waters without losing my moral compass. The echoes of past neglect were still there, but they no longer dictated my actions. They informed them. By afternoon, I made decisions about the future with calm deliberation. New boundaries were established, roles within the family recalibrated, and routines adjusted to ensure mutual respect. Social engagements, previously fraught with anxiety over judgment or misattribution, could now be approached with confidence. I embraced the freedom to participate fully, to contribute visibly, and to assert my voice when necessary. The sense of empowerment, cautious yet genuine, reinforced my belief that intelligence, patience, and moral clarity were more enduring than any transient tension or familial slight. Life, inevitably, would continue to present challenges, but I was ready to meet them with the strength and discernment earned over years of observation and strategic action. As I stood beneath the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, I felt the weight of closure settling into place. Lessons had been learned, injustices acknowledged, and the path forward made clearer. I had reclaimed my voice, earned recognition without arrogance, and established a foundation for healthier interactions. Satisfaction mingled with introspection, a recognition that life's lessons are ongoing, but that personal courage and intelligence offer a steady anchor. The past, with all its echoes, remained a teacher, but it no longer defined me. I walked slowly back toward the house, heart steady, mind sharp, and spirit quietly triumphant. I had finally found my voice, but the echoes of the past would always remind me why I chose strength over silence,